My name is Neil Apt. I am Editorial Director of Transport Topics. I would like to welcome you to the second installment of our LiveOnWeb series. If you joined us during July for our first video chat, we want to thank you for the many positive comments we received. And if you're joining us for the first time today, we are glad to have you on board. Today's chat will focus on the Transport Topics Top 100 listing of the largest private carriers in North America. The 2014 version of the annual publication was included in the August 18th print edition of Transport Topics. A copy of the Private 100 list currently is available on our website, ttnews.com, and a download will be available soon. Before getting started, I would like to thank our sponsors for today's chat, Data Driving Shipping and Registry Monitoring Insurance Services. Both of these companies offer the trucking industry innovative services. I am here again today with Dan Berth, who created the list and spearheads the publication with the help of editorial researcher Brandon Green and a large portion of the TT staff. In a few moments, we will also speak with John Sampson, Executive Director of the Agricultural and Food Transporters Conference. He will discuss the sectors that make up a large portion of the Private 100, as well as proposed rules from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration that could have a major effect on the industry's operations in the coming years. We are also happy to address your questions and comments while we chat today. You can comment directly within this article page. You can email us at share@ttnews.com, or you can tweet us using the hashtag LiveOnWebTop100. A replay of this chat and our previous one on the TT Top 100 for Hire list can be viewed on our website. Okay, with all that out of the way, I want to turn to Dan. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
Can you provide us with an overview of the list? And just so everyone is clear, can you let us know exactly what is meant by a private carrier?
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone. Private carriers are trucking fleets that are owned and operated by shippers. It has nothing to do with stock ownership, in case you're wondering. Unlike for-hire carriers, which haul goods for the general public and are ranked by annual revenue, corporate-owned fleets haul primarily for themselves, and they are ranked by tractor count, which we consider to be a proxy for their freight hauling capacity. Private fleets exist for a number of very important reasons. They're a reliable source of capacity for shippers. And they're used to haul goods between factory locations, for example. They may provide store delivery. They also provide freight hauling for specialized products. We have a company on the list, for example, that hauls nothing but waste grease that they collect from restaurants and other suppliers. And they operate in areas like oil fields where common carriers don't provide very good service, right? So there's a lot of reasons to have a private fleet. It's also important, I think, for people to remember that most shippers use a combination of for-hire and private carriers to meet all of their freight hauling needs. So that means the availability and cost of for-hire transportation can influence the size and the growth of private fleets.
So, Dan, how big is the private fleet market?
It's huge. Many people don't realize how large it is, but we estimate that the private carriers haul half of all freight volume by truck in the United States. And according to the National Private Truck Council, 3 out of 4 commercial trucks that are on the road today are operated by private fleets. So they're everywhere. And as big as they are, Neil, there was a time before trucking was deregulated in 1980 when private carriers were even more dominant than they are today. And that's because at that time the federal government maintained very tight control over freight rates and services. To get operating authority, a for-hire company had to provide evidence that a shipper could not get service in the marketplace. So many companies had their own trucks because it was hard for them to get service from for-hire carriers. But it's been 30 years since the industry was deregulated, so we've seen a lot of change. And for-hire carriers have greatly expanded their service, reduced their rates. As a consequence, many shipper-owned fleets have disappeared. In fact, in the past year, two companies that had private fleets have eliminated them. One was Kraft Foods, which was on the top 100 list as recently as 2012. And the other was GNC Nutrition. Both of these companies decided to rely on for-hire carriers to handle their freight transportation needs. And this goes on all the time.
So Dan, the TT100, the private 100, goes back to 2002. I assume that maybe Walmart at that time might have been number one based on their size. Is that correct? And can you give us a quick overview of how that has changed over the decade plus that you've been compiling the list?
All right. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. We did start this list in 2002, and Walmart was number one on that list. Now, what's interesting to me about that is Walmart at that time had a fleet of over 7,700 tractors, much larger than it is today, which is kind of strange because Walmart in that time period has more than doubled its size. So, but the reason it ranked as high as it did was because at that time Walmart owned a food distributor called McLean Company, right? Which by itself had 2,650 trucks. So Walmart eventually sold that business to Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway, and now both companies are ranked on the list. Walmart at number 4 this year, and McLean at number 7. And looking back at that first list, it was also interesting for me to recall that the second largest private fleet at the time was a relatively unknown company called Ahold, which was based in the Netherlands. And it turns out that Ahold owned a number of major supermarket chains in the United States, but they also owned a company called U.S. Food Service. And that company, like McLean, supplied food and supplies to restaurants and other institutions across the country, had a very large fleet. It was also spun off, and today U.S. Foods, as it's called, is ranked number 5 on the top 100 list. And Ahold has dropped off, in part because they sold some of their businesses and they've outsourced much of their distribution to other companies. So, Neil, I also want to make maybe a point that if you look at the composition of the top 100 top 100 private carrier list, food and merchandise companies that handle food and merchandise, like Walmart, like Safeway, Cisco, account for almost half of all the companies on the list. And some of the other major sectors that are well represented include petroleum, chemicals, and gas companies. They have about a quarter of the companies on the list. Manufacturing companies are represented with about 8% of the companies, right? And then beverage distributors, Coke and Pepsi or Dr. Pepper are the most prominent names there. They represent about 6% of the companies on the list. And if you're looking at the screen now, you're probably seeing a couple of pie charts. The first one is this breakdown of companies by name. The second one involves a breakdown of companies by tractor count. And they match up pretty well except for one category, which might be worth noting, and that is in the beverage distribution sector. As I said earlier, they represent only about 6% of companies, but they represent about 18% of all the tractors for the companies on this list. So a small number of companies have a very large number of trucks and are worth paying attention to for that reason.
Thank you, Dan. The charts you just saw and much of the information Dan has gone through so far is available in great detail in the private 100 list, again, which was published August 18th. And we're happy to address your questions and comments. You can please send them in, and we can talk about them as we proceed today. Just very quickly on the 2014 list, just to go through the top 10. PepsiCo is now number 1. Cisco is number 2. Coca-Cola, number 3. Walmart stores is now number 4 on the list. U.S. Foods, which Dan mentioned before, number 5. Halliburton, 6. McLean Co. is 7. Abrium is 8. Reyes Holdings, 9. Number 10 is CNJ Energy Services, a company that has grown through a merger with Neighbors Industry. CNJ is based in Houston, along with 2 others, Halliburton and Cisco. All three of the top 10 are all based in Houston. Dan, besides the list itself, as you talk with fleet executives, as you go through the surveys that you send out, what are you uncovering about the status of private carriers?
Yes, well, the main issue for private carriers is the same as it is for for-hire carriers. It's capacity, and how do you acquire enough capacity to meet your needs, right? We see some private fleets expanding to meet capacity needs. We also hear a lot of talk about companies increasing their use of dedicated contract carriage. And, this is interesting in part because a lot of for-hire carriers are also gravitating towards dedicated contract carriage. We spoke with one company in particular called Black Horse Carriers, based in Illinois. It does nothing but dedicated contract carriage. And its owner, Gary Nieder, told me that his business is booming right now. And there are several reasons for this. One is that dedicated service provides a more stable and predictable schedule for drivers. So this makes it easier to recruit and retain drivers, which is a big issue for all trucking companies. Shippers may also be reluctant to invest large sums of money in new equipment, and they may have trouble keeping up with trucking regulations. So dedicated represents a way for them to add incremental capacity without spending a lot of money. I like to look at dedicated as kind of a middle ground between for-hire and private carriers. And it's growing in popularity because it seems to meet the needs of shippers, carriers, and drivers.
Dan, in the story, I found interesting with Black Horse Carriers. They told you that they're running dedicated routes for about 15 automakers. They said they were making deliveries at night and using these same vehicles to serve other customers during the day. Found that interesting. Dan, through your reporting, you're also finding that private fleets are investing in new trucks with more safety features than ever before. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We spoke with 2 companies in particular, Maine's Paper and Food Service in New York and American Air Liquide Holdings in Houston. They're both buying trucks that feature anti-collision warning systems, stability control, tire pressure monitoring, and even in-cab video to record what's happening inside the truck and outside whenever there's an unusual event like hard braking or an unusual movement of the truck, right? We spoke with Mike Natazilizio of H&I Group to get an explanation for why this is happening, and he had an interesting thought, which was private carriers have an image to protect that goes beyond trucking. They obviously supply freight hauling service for their shipper owners, but they have a bigger interest, economic interest than just that. So that's driving a lot of the interest in these safety items. And there's another reason that we're seeing fleets invest in new vehicles, and that's because the newer trucks today have better fuel efficiency than before. So we talked to several industry consultants who said they're having success in persuading many private fleets to accelerate their purchases of new trucks. It's not unusual for a private carrier to keep trucks 8 to 10 years, which is about twice as long as what a for-hire carrier might do. But some of that is because these trucks run fewer miles, so they can keep them longer for that reason. But The savings that they can get from improved fuel efficiency on these trucks is so great that it makes sense now for them to step up their purchases. So that's another element. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that private carriers in general have been unafraid to invest in technology like the in-cab computers, and some of them are far ahead of their for-hire counterparts in using data analytics to assess driver productivity and monitor their cost of service, right? They're very good at this. In our survey of these private carriers this year, in fact, we found that 90% of the companies that responded said they're already using electronic logs. This is something that's not even mandated yet for all companies, right? A similar survey, we asked the same question of for-hire carriers, and it came back at 80%. So they're both very high, but you can see private carriers have even more of an edge in that area. Another interesting data point is in the use of in-cab video monitoring. About 25% of private carriers that we surveyed said they use it. That compares to about 12% for for-hire carriers.
Well, thank you, Dan. If you have any questions for Dan, we'll get to them shortly about any of the facts and figures that he is full of. I want to briefly shift topic, go to the regulatory front. I want to bring in John now. John, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for having me today.
Our pleasure. For viewers, let's start. For viewers that may be unfamiliar with your conference, wondering if you could just provide some insight as to about AFTC and your members.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. As Neil stated, I'm John Sampson. I am the Executive Director of AFTC, and we are one of 4 conferences that ATA holds. We play a very important role within ATA. We have our own board, our own membership that's compiled of ATA members, but we also work on the niche issues that are specific to our groups. Mine, of course, agriculture and food products. We're compiled of about 430 members that are also ATA members that haul livestock, commodities, farm supplies, fertilizers, as well as on the food side, we also have refrigerated trucks and dry van goods that are non-refrigerated. AFTC was originally put together in 1995. We were working on one specific issue, the ag exemption to the hours of service rule that was going through during the 1995 highway bill. And we were successful in getting that included, and it's something that continues today. Since then, our policy priorities have grown substantially, and one of those policy priorities has been the aforementioned FDA regulations, which I believe we'll talk about a little bit further on.
Yeah, we have covered in Transport Topics several times, most recently in our August 11th issue about these proposed FDA rules. We know that they're of extreme importance to you. It involves transportation, food transportation. I'm wondering if you can give a little background as to how we got to this point and where they stand and what might happen from here.
To back up just a little bit, I want to give a little history to show everybody how we got to where we're at. In 1990, Congress passed a transportation food safety law that gave DOT the oversight to actually regulate the industry. And in 2005, there was another law passed, the Sanitary Transportation of Food Law, that switched that oversight over to HHS's Food and Drug Administration. This is a law that somewhat lingered for about 5 years until FDA put out a proposed rulemaking looking at the impacts of this rule on the industry. And after a couple more years, we did see some guidance, but there was no actual action on that law. Now we fast forward to 2011, Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act, and this was a more broadly reaching rule that encompassed pretty much the entire supply chain movement of food. Some like to refer to it as farm to fork. This was in relation to or as a result of E. coli outbreaks and salmonella outbreaks that we saw in both the peanut industry and the spinach industry. And it's something that usually Congress has, when something goes wrong, then they will act on that, and that's what happened with this Food Safety Modernization Act. This was something that they wanted to look at, specifically the manufacturing and the processing of food, because that's where the food in its raw state is handled most. Now, as part of this, there were 7 sections, and the 7th section had to do with the sanitary transportation of human and animal food. And this was Congress's way of telling FDA to go back and finalize what was passed in 2005. In addition, FDA went out to the industry. They came to us and they wanted us to know that what we're doing right now is safe. What we're doing right now is the right thing to do. And so they based this sanitary transportation of food on the best industry practices. And so what ATA did, the proposed rule came out in January of this year, and we compiled a working group of about 70, both ATA members, large trade associations, and it's broad diversity anywhere from the rail industry to the Pet Food Institute to National Grain and Feed, and we wanted to put everybody in the same room to make sure that whatever changes we made to that rule were going to be a smooth transition throughout the entire supply chain. And so, working with FDA, we found that their goal throughout this entire sanitary transportation of human and animal food was to make sure that food is transported in a way that it will not become adulterated. And this adulteration term has been in law for quite some time, and ATA did not have a problem with that, but in how it's being used, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on. But all in all, we do have issues. ATA's commented on issues. FDA's received about a little over 200 comments, and one of those main topics has to do with the cost estimate of this rule on the industry.
So that's what I was going to ask you about next, John. The FDA has said they know it's going to be an expensive rule. They are estimating this covers 83,000 firms. They have suggested it's going to be, for the first year after the final rule becomes effective, might cost $149, $150 million. However, we've talked a little bit about this previously. You are suggesting, as you've talked to members, some of the comments, some of the other industry groups that are involved here, this figure might be much higher. Is that right?
That's correct. And we reached out during this comment process. We reached out to many member companies, about 80 respondents during a survey, and found current cost estimates on training and record keeping and cargo claims. And this, within the specifics of the rule, and we'll go back to the adulteration issue, they have stated that if anything goes outside of the guidelines within the rules, say that the contract, the shipping contract, states that frozen food needs to be kept at 0 degrees with a variability of 5 degrees. As the rule's currently written, if that product goes outside of that 5-degree variability for, let's say, just 2 minutes, practically that's not going to do anything to the product. But how the rule is written, that food could then be deemed adulterated and then would have to be thrown out or discarded in some form or fashion. And so, as you can see, the cargo claims during our survey results are already a big cost to the industry. If you have that term adulteration used in the way it's written in the current rule, those cargo claims could potentially skyrocket. And that's just one of the potential costs of this rule. Another potential cost has to do with the mandating of pre-cooling of trailers. And we've reached out to many members, and we understand that the pre-cooling is not something that is done every single time. It's something that is a good practice within the industry, but if you are loading ice cream and it's 95 degrees, it's very, very difficult to get that trailer down to the temperature you need to have it in order to load that product. And so they actually utilize the coldness of that product, the ice cream temperature, to bring down the temperature within the trailer. And so if we have people out there that have to pre-cool, that are mandated to pre-cool every single time, that is going to provide an extension in that cost as well. Looking at training, which is something, and going back just for a moment, FDA again verbally has continually told us that what you're doing as an industry, the best practices that you have in place are exactly what we want to see. when ATA commented in 2010 to the notice of proposed rulemaking, they stated that there are 85,000 shipments a year, and those shipments, dating back 36 years, there were only 4 instances of foodborne related instances within the transportation industry. And so if you calculate that out, you're going to get a pretty small percentage. And as you can see on the training slide, right now our members, somewhere between 0 and 5 hours, usually it's above 0, but they will train their employees for around a half a day. Now, if that, in the final rule, nothing's set yet, but if that all of a sudden doubles to 8 or 10 hours of training, then you'll see those cost estimates rise as well. And just to wrap up a little bit on this rule, there's many more pieces within. There was about 120 pages of rulemaking within the sanitary transport rule. It's due to be finalized in March of 2016, and so within ATA's comments, we want to make sure if there's any substantial changes that are made, either within one section or all the sections, that the rule be reproposed or reopened to give industry one more chance to take a look at it. And the last thing that I want to bring up is something that's very important. One issue that we've had is getting people to fully understand the impact of what's going to happen, and this rule impacts shippers, carriers, and receivers, both on the truck and the rail side. And so the onus within the rule has a lot to do with the shipping contract. And so what the shipper puts on there, the carrier has to be well aware of that. And so what we're asking and what we're trying to do is make sure that the shippers and the carriers are communicating what needs to be done and looking with a little foresight, saying that there are going to be some changes, whether they're in this rule or they're done within the industry. There are going to be some changes, and so it's very important that the shippers and the carriers are communicating what needs to be done on these different pieces within the rule.
This is obviously a very complex rule. If you have any follow-up questions on the FDA portion for John, please send them in. We have received a couple questions in the last few minutes, which we will be getting to very soon. John, briefly, I just wanted to ask you about another issue I know is important, like it is the entire industry, hours of service for AFTC, more specifically involving an exemption for livestock haulers. Is that correct?
Right. And this was something that during July of 2013, when we saw the changes both in the 34-hour restart provision and the 30-minute rest break, it was something that 34-hour restart's been hotly debated in Congress, throughout the industry, as something that has had a very negative effect on the industry. For us, for livestock haulers, those that are hauling live animals, the 30-minute rest break was something that we desperately needed to attend to. And this, when looking at it, if you have a transporter that's hauling cattle from North Carolina down to Texas in July, the last thing they want to do or have to do is sit on the side of the road for 30 minutes. And taking a look back at those hauling cattle or other live animals, they're usually an integral part of loading those trucks. And so, since this is the first 8 hours of on-duty time, you may have a guy that's hopping out of the truck, putting on his overalls, and then loading the truck, whether it's cattle or hogs or chickens or whatever it may be. And so that 8 hours of on-duty time clock is already ticking. So they may be 2 hours into their 8 hours before they even get back in the truck and get on the road. And so what we were able to do is go back to FMCSA, explain to them that live animals in a hot metal box sitting on the side of the road without ventilation for 30 minutes is an absolute disaster for animal welfare issues, as well as the product itself. And so we requested a 90-day waiver to FMCSA, and that gave them an opportunity to extend that to us right away. That's something, a waiver process through FMCSA can be done by the agency without public comment. And so we requested a 90-day waiver and were granted that in the summer of 2013 to make sure that we were able to get through the hot summer months without with being able to be exempted from that 30-minute rest break. Within that request, we also asked them for a 2-year exemption. We knew that every summer after 2013 was going to be equally hot, and so we wanted to make sure that something is in place as to give a little bit more certainty to the industry. And so we requested that 2-year exemption, and we were actually granted a 1-year exemption this past June, and that'll be something that goes through May of 2015.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dan, you came across and have reported on a couple other HOS type exemption involving private fleets.
Yes. You know, food and energy were two of the biggest sectors represented on this list, right? And both industries are being affected by the hours of service rule too. We talked with McKee Foods in particular, which is a company that was asking FMCSA for an exemption from the hours of service rule. You know, they operate their trucks with team drivers. They do a lot of loading and unloading. So the rules, especially the one requiring 30-minute break, was something that disrupted their routine, and so they were asking for an exemption. Energy companies are firms that help supply materials and product to oil drilling sites. Many of them all have actually sleeping facilities on site. So, and these drivers spend a lot of time outside the truck doing things and waiting, for example. So it's another example where, you know, the reality of these businesses clash with the proposed rule, and so we're seeing an appeal on the part of the industry to, you know, for some consideration there.
Talked a lot about the food sector already today. There have been several deals that are pending that could shake up the list and shake up the food hauling industry a bit. Can you update where several of these stand?
Yes, indeed. The food industry is definitely consolidating, and we see that in tracking many of these companies on our list. And this year, Tyson Foods kind of successfully purchased Hilscher Brands, and both those companies were on our list a year ago, so Tyson's remains, obviously. We also have previously mentioned Cisco and US Foods. Both of these companies provide food distribution to restaurants primarily, and Cisco has proposed merging with US Foods, and that deal is still being evaluated by the U.S. government for antitrust implications, so it's not finally completed, but it's in process. That would combine two of the very largest private fleets in the country, and no doubt would help the surviving company reduce its costs by being able to consolidate more freight into fewer trucks to deliver to some of the same customers, right? That's kind of the thing that's driving consolidation in the food distribution area. One grocery deal worth mentioning is Safeway, which was a public company and received an offer from the owner of Albertsons to be acquired, and that has been accepted by the shareholders, but and that's not finally completed, but it's in process. That will result in a fleet that will likely be the largest among all the grocers on our list next year, if that goes through, right? Kroger Company is right now the largest grocer fleet, and so it'll be interesting to see how that turns out and whether we see more deals in the coming year. I'm sure we will.
John, before we went on today, we were talking about the consolidation issue, and I know you had some thoughts on that.
Right, and I think you know, it's important to note, even though this is the private 100 carriers list, that this could potentially impact the for-hire carriers. Understandably, when companies get larger, they're able to be a little bit more picky with their standards, and so we could see an increase in demand for technology on trucks, as Dan was discussing earlier with some of the new technologies that are coming on board, and so that could potentially be an increase in costs to the for-hire companies that do deal with some of these larger companies.
Something we'll have to watch for. I want to go to some of the questions that we've come in, put it on the spot here. We have one from Mark. Do you see growth in intermodal shipping with private fleets? Flatbed intermodal is a relatively new shipping method. As an example, long pipe is traditionally only shipped by truck and flatbed trailer. Doesn't make sense. Dan, do you have any thoughts about intermodal? Seems to be growing anywhere. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on that question from Mark.
It's being discussed, but we don't see any evidence really of it yet. Something we'll certainly keep an eye on because it is something that, as long as fuel costs remain as high as they are, intermodal is going to be an attractive option. So a lot of private fleets use their trucks for shorter hauls, so maybe intermodal isn't quite the competitive threat that it is for maybe some long haul for hire carriers. But I think it's something that is a long-term trend that we will see some use of in the future, yes.
I have one more that's come in from Gary, who was inquiring about the driver pay and any thoughts on driver pay and driver shortage in relation to the private fleet market.
Well, it's worth mentioning that private carriers pay better than for-hire carriers in general. In fact, as part of our coverage, we looked at data that was compiled by Gordon Klemp. He does a quarterly pay survey for trucking, and he indicates that private carriers drivers, on average, earn $73,829 a year, and that compares to an average pay for a dry-van truckload driver of $47,844. So that tells you there's a gap in pay between these two sectors. And that certainly is something that has helped private carriers to retain drivers and to attract them from the for-hire side. Their turnover rates are much lower than the for-hire carriers already. But having said that, it is interesting to me that we picked up comments from a number of private fleets who say they are having issues getting drivers. One of the reasons is that many of these private fleets require their drivers to load and unload, and that is something that not all drivers favor. We're seeing companies now with some issues related to medical certification. Many of you probably know that over the past year, the FMCSA has required doctors to be certified to do driver exams, medical exams, right? So they're being much more careful about approving these drivers. That's holding up certification for some of these drivers. And the other thing to keep in mind, I guess, is that the average age of drivers for private carriers is high. It's over 55, I think, and which is higher than the for-hire side. And it's only going up, I guess, as time goes by. So retirements at some point will be an issue for private carriers. I think this is an issue that many companies are going to be looking more closely at in the very near future.
It's clear that the shortage issue is not about private fleets, it's not about for-hire fleets, it's about trucking in general, as we talked about in our last chat.
Yes.
Many of the things, the information Dan has been talking about, we have been talking about today, is included in the Private 100 list, the annual publication, which again was published on August 18th, and the list is available on our website. And thank you for the people that have sent in questions. As we begin to wrap up on the chat today, I wanted to turn back to you, Dan, for maybe a few final thoughts on the private fleet market right now.
Yes, well, thank you. As we look ahead at as we look at what's ahead for the trucking industry, what I'd like to suggest is that the future may look a lot like the past. And what I mean by that is that we may be entering a period in which it will be more difficult for everyone to secure freight hauling capacity, and where the government will exert more control over your operations, not by setting rates or dictating routes, which they used to do, but by regulating safety, setting fuel efficiency standards for trucks, making rules for training drivers, and even testing the knowledge of new entrants into the industry. So I think that's something that we all need to think about.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.
We want to thank you for joining us today. We know some of you may be new within the TT fold. If you're one of them, I would encourage you to consider becoming a subscriber. In conjunction with today's chat, our circulation team has set up a special offer for you. Please visit ttnews.com/LOW26 for additional details. Before signing off, I wanted to again thank our sponsors, Data Driven Shipping and Registry Monitoring Insurance Services. Likewise, I would like to thank John for providing his insight, Dan Berth for his work in putting the TT 100 Private 100 together, and the entire TT and ATA crew that has helped make our first 2 chats successful. As a reminder, a replay of this chat will be available on our website shortly. I also want to mention we hope to have an announcement regarding our next chat shortly after Labor Day. Until then, thank you for joining us.
How much time elapsed?
Are you good?
41
41.
minutes.
That was what you were
Where you wanted to
suggesting,
be,
right?
Long enough.